Hi there, it's Miss Tiffany from the Butler Area Public Library, and I'm here with another Library 101 video. Remember, Library 101 is a series of videos that I'm creating to teach you all about the library, different library services, and information literacy in general. On today's Library 101 video, we're going to be talking about the difference between fiction and nonfiction. So first of all, we're going to cover fiction. What is a piece of work, whether it's a book or a movie or whatever, that is considered fiction? Well, fiction tells a story, and it's not a true story. It's a story that is made up. Other words that you can use to describe a fiction story include pretend, fantasy, and fake. So if a story is made up or pretend or fantasy or fake, then that is a fiction story. Fiction has the intention to entertain the reader. That means it's going to tell you something that's going to make you feel a certain emotion, or it's going to continue a storyline that you are familiar with already. In a work of fiction, the focus is on different story elements. Things like the characters. These are the people or the things that the story is really about. Also, the setting. That is where the story is going to take place. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end to a fiction story. And typically, a fiction story revolves around some kind of a problem and how you solve it. So there's a problem and then a resolution. Often, fiction stories have illustrations in them. And you can see this most often in the picture book section of the library. Typically, picture books have illustrations, which are pictures that are drawings. Sometimes chapter books have those as well, but not always. A fiction book is a book that you have to read in order. Remember, I said that the story elements include a beginning, a middle, and an end. So a fiction story doesn't make sense if you start reading it in the middle. You have to start at the first page and read the book all the way through in order to get the full story. And finally, fiction books are typically found in the library organized by alphabetical order. So fiction books in the library would include things like picture books or chapter books, but we also have fiction in our easy reader section and in our graphic novel section. If you look at the spine of those books, typically you will see the first 3 letters of the author's last name. And we use that to put the books in alphabetical order on the shelves. So that way you know that all of the books that have been written by Jeff Kinney, for example, will be shelved under K-I-N in alphabetical order. So now that we've covered fiction, which remember we said is a made-up story, let's talk a little bit about nonfiction. A nonfiction book tells the truth. So it is something that is factual, that could include interesting facts about anything, really. That could also include a biography, which is a book that tells the life story of someone important. But this also includes books that give you instructions. So these would be books like how to make something, like a cookbook or a DIY craft book. With a nonfiction book, the intent is to inform you or educate you. So it is trying to teach you something that you didn't know already, or to teach you more about something you may have already known. The focus in a nonfiction book is on text elements. These include things like headings on the pages, charts and graphs. Often there are photographs with captions in a nonfiction book. With a nonfiction book, because it's not telling you a story, it's telling you different facts, you don't necessarily have to read it in order. In fact, you don't necessarily have to read the whole thing. For example, if you were doing research on what hamsters eat, you might not want to read an entire book about hamsters. You might want to just read a chapter of a book about hamsters that tells you what hamsters eat. And with the nonfiction books in our library, we use something called the Dewey Decimal System to put them in order on the shelves. Now, we'll talk about the Dewey Decimal System in a little bit more detail in a future video, but we use the Dewey Decimal System to tell us where we put the books on the shelves, and we include markers on the shelves that tell you what numbers are found on each set of shelves. So that is a general overview on the difference between fiction, which remember we said is a made-up story, or nonfiction, which we said is something that tells you true facts about something. So we went over all the differences between fact-based books, which would be the nonfiction books, or story-based books, which would be fiction books. But just talking about it doesn't necessarily make it completely clear. So I thought it would be good if we looked at some examples of books and figured out together whether they were fiction or nonfiction. So to make it nice and simple, all of the books that we are going to look at today are about dogs. So you don't really have to worry about what the subject is, but using the information we just saw in our presentation, we're going to try to figure out if these are fiction books or nonfiction books. So the first book that we are going to look at is called Bad Bella by Ali Standish. And this is what it looks like. So that's what the cover looks like, but let's take a look inside the book. So the first thing we notice is that this book has lots of text in it, and it's continuous text, right? There is no heading, there are no charts and graphs, and there's only this tiny little illustration at the beginning of each chapter. And it sounds like this is a book about a dog named Bella. So already it sounds like we might have a character in this book. So based on what we learned in the slideshow, do you think that this book, which has a character named Bella, and it has lots of text, and it has no headings, no charts, no graphs, do you think this is a fiction book or a nonfiction book? We have one more piece of information that we can look at if you're not sure. Remember, I said that the way we organize the books in the library, if they are fiction, we use the first 3 letters of the author's last name. And if it were nonfiction, we would use the Dewey Decimal System, which includes numbers. So we don't have any numbers on this label. Based on all of the information we learned, we know that this is a fiction book. In fact, this is a juvenile fiction book, otherwise known as a chapter book, and it is shelved in the chapter book section of the children's department. Let's take a look at another book. This book is called Dogs 101, Your Ultimate Guide to Man's Best Friend by Rebecca Paley. And here's what the cover of this looks like. So just based on the title and the way the cover of the book looks, we might have a little bit of an indication whether this is fiction or nonfiction, but let's take a look inside. So it looks like this book really focuses on different text elements. We have headings and subheadings, and we have photographs. And if we look a little bit further, we even have a section that tells us explicitly that it is teaching us facts about dogs. So based on the information that we learned today, a book that uses real pictures and has headings and tells us that it's going to tell us facts is going to be a nonfiction book. And remember, you can always look at the spine label to see, is there numbers on there? There is a number. This is the Dewey Decimal number that I was telling you about. The Dewey Decimal number for this book is 636.71. And that number tells us where on the shelf to put this nonfiction book. Let's look at one more. So this book is called Good Rosie, and it was written by Kate DiCamillo, and it tells us that there are pictures by Harry Bliss. So already we know that there are pictures or illustrations in this book, and we have a hint from the title that it is about a dog named Rosie. So that sounds again like we have a character in this book. And notice the character is in a very specific place that is called the setting. So if there are characters and a setting in books and we use illustrations, it sounds like we're telling a story, right? It sounds like this would be considered a fiction book because it's telling us the story of a dog named Rosie. That means it's going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's going to solve some kind of problem that happens in the story, right? So this has just been a very brief introduction on the difference between fiction and nonfiction books. I've also created a worksheet, which I'm going to link in the description of this video, that has an exercise for you to practice thinking about whether a book is fiction or nonfiction. And this exercise uses titles of actual books that we have in the children's department at the Butler Area Public Library. So the idea is that you are going to sort those titles into a stack of fiction books and a stack of nonfiction books. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions about anything, or you would like to suggest a topic for a future Library 101 video, I'm including my email address in the description of this video as well. Until then, thanks and happy reading.